Hello and welcome everyone. Thanks for joining us today. This webinar on transhumanism is sponsored by the Institute for Human Ecology at the Catholic University of America. The IHE is the nation's leading academic institute committed to increasing scientific understanding of the economic, cultural, and social conditions vital for human flourishing. And we all gather today to talk about transhumanism, the last heresy, ? So thank you for all of you for joining. We have a good turnout today. I would like to start with a brief housekeeping item. If you would like to ask a question throughout the seminar to each one of us or any one of us, then please submit the question via the chat, the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. So towards the end, there will be about 15 minutes of questions and answers. Again, the questions can be open to any one of us or specifically to one of us speakers, and we'll try to answer as many questions as possible. So not in order of importance, I just should like to start with myself as an introduction. My name is Jan Bentz, Dr. Jan Bentz. I serve as a lecturer and tutor at Blackfriars Studium, and I'm an associate member of the Faculty of Theology and Religion here in Oxford at the University of Oxford. I also am member of a faculty of Memorial College in Louisville, Kentucky. I have a doctorate from a Roman Pontifical Athenaeum and a master's in art and architecture and in religion and ecumenism. And my interests are metaphysics, history of philosophy, Thomism, and how modern philosophy how medieval philosophy influences modern philosophy and beyond. So that's my research topic, and I'm also very interested in utopia and transhumanism, and that's why I'm here today. I'm very, very pleased to be joined by two great colleagues, university colleagues and friends, Father Michael Baggot and Wael Taji Miller. Father Michael is coming in from Rome today, Wael coming in from Budapest, Hungary. So Father Michael is an associate professor of bioethics at the Pontifical Athenaeum Regina Apostolorum and an invited professor of theology at the Pontifical University of Thomas Aquinas for the initiated, called the Angelicum. He is also a member of the Catholic Institute of Technology. He's a research scholar at the UNESCO Chair in Bioethics and Human Rights and serves as a member of the Scholarly Advisory Board for Magisterium AI, a very interesting AI developed to help with research of papal and ecclesiastical documents. So check that out on your own time if you have the chance. His writings appeared in First Things, Studia Bioetica, the National Catholic Bioethics Quarterly, and National Catholic Register, as well as Medicine, Health, Care, and Philosophy. Wael Taji Miller, on the other hand, is an editor at the Axioma Center, the first Christian faith-based think tank in Hungary, and a doctoral candidate in neuroscience at Semmelweis University in Budapest, where he slavishly uses all of his time in the lab every day, and we've talked lots about that. Wael's research explores how systems of culture, economics, religion, and biological sex interact with human behavior, and his published works on these topics have appeared in peer-reviewed scientific journals, as well as a variety of Western media outlets in English and beyond. So thank you, Father Michael, and thank you for Wael for joining us today. So the idea of this webinar came really about because transhumanism seems to be one of the great umbrella terms of all kinds of interesting thoughts and potentially even dangerous thoughts about human nature, how to conceive of human nature, and specifically how to conceive of a certain type of humanism and how to overcome that humanism. So today's lecture will be structured in the following manner, and you can see that the inner German needs to immediately talk about the structure here. So I'll give a brief presentation, followed by Wael's brief presentation, which is and then followed by Father Michael's presentation. Mine will be more philosophical. Wael's will be more empirical, will be more scientific, and Father Michael's will be theological. So I hope that all of you listeners will get a very good overview of the subject from three different angles that should overlap in many instances, and that should give you a nice, well-rounded picture about the topic and how to, what to pay attention to from a Christian point of view, from a Catholic point of view, and maybe what to be careful about, but also where the potential lies, where there is potential for further development on a scientific, on a theological, on a philosophical level. So, welcome everybody again. Very happy that you can all make it. So I'm going to share my screen with you, and I have some slides to follow, that you can follow, and that hopefully will make it easier to follow along with what I'm saying. I'm trying to keep this as brief and concise as possible, even though, as usual, I feel like I prepared too much material. So I think transhumanism can be approached from many different ways. Specifically, a critical approach to transhumanism can be done from many different ways. And with both of the other and my other colleagues here, we're working on a book on this as well, which I will keep all of you updated on. But I think one of the most clear and concise ways of doing it is looking at transhumanism as a kind of utopia. And utopia here is not something positive. In modern parlance, we have developed this kind of opposition of utopia and dystopia, utopia being positive, dystopia being negative. Classically understood, utopia is actually always negative. So it's the no space, the space where we cannot go and what we cannot reach. So can speak lots about that, but this is how I understand it today for my presentation. So my thesis is borrowed from a Hungarian philosopher, not applied to transhumanism, but to utopia in general. So I will speak today about utopia briefly and then apply it to transhumanism. Okay, so utopia is basically to politics what heresy is to the faith, or what heresy is to theology. It's not merely a political fantasy, but a heretical inversion of the order of being. And so utopia to the political realm can be seen analogical as heresy to the theological. Now, I got you the definition of heresy from the Catechism of the Catholic Church just as a working citation, which is, heresy is the obstinate post-baptismal denial of some truth which must be believed with divine and Catholic faith, or it is likewise an obstinate doubt concerning the same. And I feel like this is generally applicable to all Christian denominations, in the sense that every Christian denomination has some kind of idea of heresy. The non-Christian or the inverted Christian understanding becomes heretical no matter which church you belong to within the Christian context. So the analogy then is that utopianism is the obstinate post-Christian denial of the fallen condition of man and the rejection of historical, social, and moral limits that must be acknowledged in any just political order, or it is likewise an obstinate confusion of temporal progress with eschatological redemption. That's a lot of big words, and I'm going to try to give some examples towards the second half of my presentation. So what utopia is in a nutshell, is a hyperbolic and warped image of the political good, of the common good. So one that analogously resembles true political order, but by exaggerating it beyond what is real and using and abusing misplaced hope, turning it into some kind of pseudo-theology and pseudo-eschatology. So, with Vöglin's words, if you're familiar with his work, utopia is a perennial heresy because it tends to and seeks to immanentize the eschaton. So it tries to realize the city of God on earth. Simply said, it tries to establish paradise on earth. And most of the utopian rhetoric thrives on this core idea, okay? The utopian and the transhumanist will rarely talk about the negative side effects and the collateral damage that comes with their political agenda and their even ideological or philosophical agenda. They will talk about the positives, but not the negatives, focusing on the, well, paradisical elements. So there's a couple of elements of utopia, I think, which are pertinent to transhumanism. So I just want to list them here very briefly. for your attention. Number one is that it absolutizes autonomy, so it declares man as self-sufficient, and very specifically self-sufficient in terms of anything transcendent. So a man is self-sufficient, is independent on his own, specifically though, and perfectly free in this kind of Enlightenment idea of freedom, specifically so in independence from the divine source. The second point is that it rejects human nature. So it denies the permanent features of human nature and proposes instead an ever-changing flux that culminates in a new man. And one could say, well, the new man is kind of the new human nature, and that's true, but that new man never really appears. It's not really real, and none in any of the transhumanist rhetoric and points that so far have been produced, that new man may be described, but is not really real. So you cannot see an example of it working. They usually use examples from the past, let's say in technological advancements, or in political advancements, or in even industrial advancements, but there is really no example of this new man that the transhumanist tries to use, to create an appeal of his own program. Utopia also confuses progress with redemption. So progress becomes salvific. It becomes something that is intrinsically positive. And that is very similar to this Gnostic return of the original innocence. I'll say more about that towards the end. And last but not least, it substitutes metaphysics with ideology. It is unphilosophical in a certain way. And philosophical realism, one could say, is replaced with blueprint thinking and sophistry. So empty words and empty promises. All right. So to add to this, and then I will speak about transhumanism, don't worry, is this idea that the utopian rhetoric is a second-order mythology. So, and this is really this is building on things that, for example, Harari developed, this idea that myth has been overcome by science and there is no more myth. The old Greek gods are really the ideals that today we know could be realized by scientific progress. But what it effectively is doing is it's presenting a counterfeit myth which is born from the exhaustion of real transcendence. So utopianism and transhumanism have the structural motifs of myth, so order, transformation, and telos, but they lack the divine orientation. And the political actualization of that turns into some kind of Gnostic metaphysics, focusing on the self-perfecting humanity. Now, this again is this immanentization of the eschaton. Now, I'm going to skip this and I'm going to go straight to the three transhumanists that I want to apply this to, just to keep with a schedule. So the three transhumanists that I'm grappling with and that I want to present to you today are, on the one hand, Yuval Noah Harari. He is a historian, best-selling author. He just published a new book called Nexus, which is a book on rethinking communications and social communications. His more famous book, and the one that we kind of have to tackle, is Homo Deus. It's called A Brief History of Tomorrow, and is kind of his transhumanist manifesto in the garb of a history book, really. The other famous person that I'm dealing with in my presentation here is Ray Kurzweil. So he is, he titles himself a futurist, inventor, and a director of engineering at Google. He's a leading advocate of technological singularity and human enhancement. And last but not least, Nick Bostrom, used to be here in Oxford, philosopher and, now former director of the Future of Humanity Institute in Oxford, pioneer in existential risk and superintelligence studies. So what I've compiled, what I want to show you today, is basically this chart. And this chart shows you the utopian elements and how they're realized by transhumanists. And this will be the last bit of my presentation. I have some other historic examples that we can briefly go to, but I think this is kind of the beef. So For the utopian diagnosis, or he presents a diagnosis of evil as external, which we can find in all of these three transhumanists. So for Harari, human suffering arises from ignorance, biological limitations. For Bostrom, the same biological frailty, a lack of foresight because of human weakness. And for Kurzweil, this idea of disease and death and biological aging are really software problems. And all of these three employ the same rhetoric. They employ the rhetoric of these are all problems that can be solved by algorithm. Now I have the Gnostic element added here to this chart, which is this idea that evil is external. And for the Gnostic, the body and the body is basically a cage, and thus the cause of all of this flawed order that humans have to live by. The denial of human nature, on the other hand, finds itself a kind of a different realization. For Harari, there is no soul in the classical sense of the word, so humans become hackable animals, and that's very much the language that he uses. For Bostrom, human nature is mutable, and it's really overcoming evolution and overtaking evolution in that direction. And for Kurzweil, human biology is a temporary phase, and this idea that consciousness can be uploaded. And I'm sure that many of you have heard this before. For the Gnostic, and this is how we can find this, human nature is false. It's something dark, and the true self needs to be discovered. You start by not really recognizing your true self, but by having to discover your true self, and that being the goal of your life. So the blueprint construction varies a little bit, and Harari himself, for example, gives multiple options for how this transhumanism can be realized. He advocates for this dataist system, or even dataist religion, as he calls it, a global techno-religion based on algorithmic optimization. For him, basically, in order for humanism to survive, it has to become something that goes beyond humanism, hence transhumanism. For Kurzweil, for Bostrom, he proposes a sort of a superintelligent framework for engineered evolution. For Kurzweil, he talks about the singularity, so precise technical roadmap to this human-machine merger. And again, for the Gnostics, more general, salvation comes from gnosis, from knowledge about this, so secret knowledge that is held by an elite group of people that makes you see reality for what it is. Again, the obligatory Matrix reference, I think, is in place here. Then there is a suspension of history and transcendence in all of them. So Harari rejects theology as myth. All theology is myth. All theology that has ever existed in the human history, as he records it, has been nothing but myth and has been replaced by scientific understanding of modernity. And it's not very clear whether he says this is a positive or negative thing, but he definitely says that the foundation of modernity is the wager, and the wager is trading meaning for power. Leaving meaning behind and gaining power. Okay, same trend can be seen in both others, and this obviously is also rooted in Gnosticism. So this created world, this material world, is an illusion, and salvation lies outside of this illusion in a higher realm or higher condition that you can reach by a kind of variety of ways. And the moral justification of coercion, which is important. Harari warns of data control, yet justifies algorithmic governance as something inevitable. And ignoring it, not jumping on board, is ultimately doomed to be futile. Bostrom defends enhancement ethics. Kurzweil, in this regard, has an optimism, but this optimism justifies technological acceleration, and doubters are anti-progress or fear-driven and thus must be overridden, which is a classical utopian rhetoric as well. And so Gnostics, the uninitiated must be left behind or must be corrected. Coercion is justified by the elite. So there are many, many examples of this, but I have a couple of practical examples in politics. Since I'm coming to the end of my time, I don't need to go maybe too much in detail, but we have the the China social credit system, I think, which is based on behavioral optimization. We have the kind of everything that is becoming more electronic, the digital IDs and what they should be linked to, that IDs should be linked to bank accounts and so forth, and can be, back then there was, this idea of the vaccine passport under the COVID era, and the digital compliance tools that go with it, which were framed as liberating. So there's a couple of political examples I think that I can elaborate on, but I want to stop here and leave the floor to Wael. So I've noted some questions came in, so thank you, but I'm going to hand over the floor now to Wael. Go ahead.
Hi there. Thanks very much, everyone, for their time. God willing, today we will be able to continue from Jan's excellent presentation. Here we are. So having heard Jan's discussion about the sort of fundamental ontology of transhumanism, I think it may now be useful, God willing, to go into some of the more tangible aspects of what transhumanism seeks to do and why it may be good or bad or even outright impossible. So fundamentally, transhumanism presents itself as a scientific movement. It's a march toward human progress through the conquest of biology, the eradication of disease, the expansion of human capabilities to the infinite. As a neuroscientist, you can imagine I might have some problems with this view, but here what I want to challenge is whether it's a legitimate enterprise at all. So I want to start right at the end with death. So in the 2018 horror film Annihilation, the protagonist, who is played by the excellent Natalie Portman, is a cancer biology professor. And at one point, she's delivering a monologue to her husband, explaining that death, like aging, is merely a fault in our genes. So this idea of death as a malfunction, which is erroneously written into the DNA or life history of the human organism, it has a very long history, and that history predates even the birth of Christ. So for Gnostic philosophers in the classical era, this idea of death as defect formed a central dogma around which the rest of their worldview was built. Things which die or are composed of physical matter, which is to say, essentially all, literally all forms of organic life, are bad. Things which are thought not to die, such as the spirit, which of course the Gnostics equated with consciousness, these are good and transcendent. But the Gnostics didn't just stop there. They continued this line of thinking by positing that the physical realm itself, which is to say our entire observable universe, is false, some kind of mere simulation that is regurgitated by a malevolent demiurge. Meanwhile, the spirit or consciousness, this sort of grotesque extension of I think, therefore I am, is what is fundamentally real. So death is ultimately defeat in the Gnostic paradigm, because death is that point whereupon thinking must cease, whereupon no more words can be said, and whereupon the whole enterprise to achieve this sort of twisted perfection has to ultimately pause. Death has been the opponent of Gnosticism since even, I think, since Plato's cave, and perhaps long before. And you can see in Plato's cave as well something quite interesting implicitly buried there, which is this idea that the man who is in the cave is able to, through the force of his own will, it's some sort of Nietzschean der Will zur Macht, some sort of power of the will and the will to power at once. He's able to exert forces on the natural world that allow him to surpass his limits. So through his powers of observation, he can see that he's in the cave. He can then use his powers of will to turn around and climb out of it. So it's something like understanding the laws of physics allows you to violate the laws of physics, or understanding information allows you to achieve some sort of perfection. But how, if at all, could we even hope or think to defeat death? Well, I have some examples for you here. So one solution, and this is probably the most commonly discussed one at campus, I would imagine, is that which is pursued by people like American entrepreneur Brian Johnson, who boasts a net worth of around $400 million and is seeking to biohack his way out of death. So Brian Johnson's personal protocol, of course, entails taking more than 100 pills a day, confining himself to an extremely restricted diet, injecting himself with his own son's blood plasma. So veritable vampirism, it would seem, is back in some sense. But supplements, unfortunately, are, or perhaps fortunately, are no solution to the boundaries that are placed upon us by fundamental laws of biological existence. The most important of these for our consideration right now would be homeostasis, which is to say, the more you push, in a sense, the more biology kicks back. Very similar things can be seen in physics and in chemistry as well. It's just arguably one of the basic patterns of reality. If any of you have ever tried to stay up for multiple nights to make a deadline, you'll know exactly what I'm talking about when I say that there are severe consequences for trying to violate these laws and twist the universe to your will. But that doesn't stop people from trying. In the case of one sort of super transhumanist enterprise, which I would call the gender reassignment enterprise, you see, for instance, how people who seek to become women or men through the use of external hormones which are foreign to their system often find that upon their cessation of these hormones, the kickback or the swing back is even drives their testosterone or estrogen levels even lower than they were before. In a sense, this type of existence, or maybe it's more better phrased as fighting against existence, which is sustained by pills or even gene editing to a certain extent. This is all temporary stuff. And the problem that we have there, therefore, is, in the case of gene editing, I would say doomed to fail, but that's a different topic. The problem that we have here is that part of defeating death involves conquering time, in a sense. And so if we're still time bound, then the enterprise is, again, as I mentioned, doomed to failure. So what about other means to conquer death? Well, one we've already sort of heard about is consciousness. So surely if the body fails, we could just transfer our consciousness into some meat machine or meat carrier, repeating this process each time the new body fails. Or maybe even better, as Ray Kurzweil, the sort of techno-prophet of this movement, claims, we could simply transfer our consciousness into machines of some kind, upload it into the cloud. Coming at this from the perspective of neuroscience, my response to this proposition is not no, but why. So why? Neither I nor any scientist with any credibility in the field has managed to demonstrate that consciousness itself is transferable. I mean, clearly, of course, consciousness doesn't part possess a material substrate. We have conscious sensations of the processes that are occurring in our physical bodies throughout our nervous system at every level, from the gut to the fingertips. But that doesn't entail or even suggest transferability of whatever consciousness is. Christian views of biology tend to view the human person as somewhat of a trinity: mind, body, and spirit. So in this sense, the mind can be seen as a sort of a facilitator, which allows the bodily and spiritual aspects of man to interact and express themselves holistically. And this view, the Christian view, is also not scientifically proven, as far as we know, nor is it, of course, falsifiable. But the notion that consciousness is the software of the human hardware and can be run on another hardware, just like you would use WhatsApp on your phone as opposed to your laptop, this doesn't seem to have a robust basis for it. Rather, it's wishful speculation, that is to say, utopianism, that the pursuit of it itself can have very dangerous consequences. And in this solipsistic impulse to upload ourselves to the cloud, just very much like with the impulse to edit or biohack ourselves to immortality, what you see is something that strikes me as a subconscious desire to escape from everyone else. Because after all, if we're only meat machines carrying this eternal essence, other people don't really matter to us. We can become immortal, we can upload ourselves, and behind all of that seems to be the desire to leave everyone else behind. That brings us to another form of what I would call Gnosto-transhumanism, something very much in the middle, which is this idea to go to Mars. Now, Dr. Bentz spoke earlier about the desire to have a very small, sophisticated elite exert its control over everyone else, sort of rendering them redundant, but also at the same time being only significant insofar as any elite can be significant in relation to them. So we dominate them, we overcome them, we leave them behind. In the dream or fantasy or fever dream or whatever you would call it of go to Mars, let's go to Mars, just go to Mars. This is the new anthem. You see very much the same things that are reflected in Brian Johnson's motto, don't die. Of course, he knows full well that even if in some world he were able not to die, we still would. Just as Elon Musk knows full well that even if he were able to go to Mars and live in some climate-controlled, somehow earthquake-proof, radiation-proof hemisphere of joy, pleasure, and bliss, we would still be here. So again, somehow in this fear of death that transhumanists seem to embody, consciously and unconsciously, there seems to be this desire to leave the rest of us behind, back in the cave, stuck where we were before, with no prospects for improvement or enlightenment of any kind. We will be left behind and they will achieve transcendence, transcendence of the only sort that really matters to them, which is the escape of death. I now want to step back and ask sort of more of a meta question. But why do we want transhumanism in the first place? Well, obviously, we, as in the people here giving this talk, and probably, or at least hopefully most of those listening to it, don't necessarily want transhumanism, but many people do. Those who are either confirmed to be within the circles of the elite, the rich, the powerful, or those aspiring for that status. This is the latter group is something I think you'll find if you use X or Reddit too much. Lots of groups of people echoing this very malevolent dream to transcend while we all suffer and die. It's clear that there are three main goals that sort of seem to be driving this. It's the ambition of achieving perfection without any repentance, right? So instead of apologizing for my flaws, I simply shed those flaws, like my human form or the planet Earth and human society. We want to be saved without having a doctrine of salvation. So that, again, is core to all three of these attempts that you see. And we want to live forever. But the strangest thing about this is, if you were to take the transhumanist view at its best, then it would seem that we really have nothing to live for. So amidst this sort of paradoxical landscape, we're left kind of with more questions than we were in the beginning. So here I want to ask a question for all of you to think about. What would an anti-Gnostic or perhaps anti-transhumanist telos look like? So if the transhumanist telos is the transcendence beyond all boundaries of limited information, limited lifespan, limited capabilities, limited physical location, being bound to the four seasons on planet Earth, the changing of the climate and the tides, all of this which they want to transcend beyond, what would an anti-that telos look like? And here I'd like to share with you all some pictures I took while I was on my pilgrimage in Egypt in 2021, because there I think I found it. So Isaiah 25 says, "He will swallow up death forever, and the Lord God will wipe away tears from all faces. The rebuke of his people he will take away from the earth, for the Lord has spoken." I realize that this is a mostly Catholic audience, but fortunately, both for all of you and for me as a Coptic Orthodox Christian, the 21 martyrs of Libya, or Shuhada Libya, are saints to all of us. And we should consider why. We should consider that in comparison to those who fear death, there is an opposite, and it is not those who love death or are hungry for death. It's those who have proven to God and to the rest of us that they were able to conquer it. I want to read one more biblical quote, 1 Corinthians 15:54. "So when this corruptible has put on incorruption, and the mortal has put on immortality, then shall be brought to pass the saying that is written, death is swallowed up in victory." And finally, I want to leave you all with my perspective on the fundamental problem that the Gnostics and the transhumanists have recognized and are trying to answer in their own way, which is the way to perfection. Well, to me, the way to perfection is through salvation. and not through information. Thank you all very much for your time.
Thank you for those two fantastic presentations. To build on that, I want to bring us back to one of the figures that Dr. Bentz spoke of, Nick Bostrom. Nick Bostrom has been a leading philosopher of the transhumanist movement and one of the chief authors of a frequently asked questions document, which I often describe as the sort of catechism of contemporary secular transhumanism, because it's well organized according to major questions that people frequently ask of the transhumanists. So if you really want to understand what contemporary secular transhumanists think about their own movement, about their own convictions, it's hard to think of a better place to go that's more clear and systematic. And Bostrom speaks of this movement as being both intellectual and cultural. So there is that rigorous philosophical reflection together with the effort through mass media, through film, through art to shape not only minds, but also hearts, to shape the imagination, to shape aspirations and desires. So it's an intellectual and cultural movement, and it's focused primarily on enhancement. Enhancement at the physical level, of our emotions, of our even moral life, of our lifespan, and of our cognitive capacities. So, with this idea of becoming stronger, faster, fitter, happier, the transhumanists seek to harness all of the resources of emerging technologies and contemporary developments. Now, Bostrom in this text also makes very clear that he sees contemporary transhumanism as a development of previous schools of secular enlightenment. And so he sees that step forward in the name of reason and progress. And so for many, religion is an outdated set of myths, dreams that have not been fulfilled. But ironically enough, we find quite often a kind of quasi religious tendency or thrust in many secular transhumanists today. Bostrom himself, later in this document, The Frequently Asked Questions, says that he sees transhumanism as sharing many of the same goals and projects of traditional religion. But he says, in contrast, transhumanism actually gets the job done. It actually makes progress. So we have traditional religions, like Catholicism, for instance, that have made these great promises of conquering all of the common enemies, aging, sickness, suffering, death. But according to Bostrom and other transhumanists, these are dreams that are held out of a better world, whereas they haven't been fulfilled. Now, transhumanism comes to actually remedy these problems, these perennial difficulties of human nature: aging, sickness, suffering, and death. So I think on the one hand, there's a point of common ground here. The transhumanists have an acute sense of the consequences of sin. Unfortunately, they've lost all notion of the rest of the story of salvation. There's no clear sense of a creator, of any objective intrinsic order to this creation, and therefore no hope of being liberated through divine grace from the consequences of these sins. We are, in many ways, in this view, cosmic orphans. We're left to our own devices. And I think this profound influence of secularism, and I think also quite a bit of postmodernism with its commitment to the radical fluidity of personal identity and the resistance to the constraints of meta-narratives or the constraints of an objective order, an objective human nature. This blending of postmodern fluidity and identity and this fundamental commitment to the exclusion of God and traditional religion helps to make a lot of sense why transhumanists see the last best hope for our salvation, for our liberation from these ills of aging, sickness, suffering, and death as coming through our own devices. This is the best that we can possibly hope for. And so it's a movement that does, in the end, ironically propose a sort of secularized, immanentized hope. So one of the greatest aspirations and goals that's been alluded to is this notion of digital immortality. Because while the transhumanists have typically a tremendous concern for their bodily well-being, we've seen this with Brian Johnson and the others, right? They want to maximize, optimize these physical, cognitive, emotional experience in our life. They have a great interest in improving the body. Many of them see that transhuman enhancement phase as being but a step toward a more profound liberation that results in a post-humanity. And that post-humanity is typically seen as the full-scale liberation from the limits of the body. Because many of those common enemies, aging, sickness, suffering, and death, may be mitigated through our technological advances, but they linger, they remain persistent precisely because of the fundamental fragility and vulnerability of the body. So there's that paradox, a movement that seems fiercely materialist, physicalist, preoccupied with bodily well-being, often to the exclusion of higher spiritual values, at the same time ends with a profoundly negative view of the body as that kind of locus, that source of these great enemies, these great problems. And so it makes sense to me why many of them will shift toward that post-human aspiration, that kind of digital immortality, that effort to map all of the data of our neurons, to achieve a kind of whole brain emulation that might capture the information, the pattern of data that they think of as the self. And that mysterious self, which is not considered a spiritual soul, but which is not identical with the body either, that mysterious self, because of the background of radical dualism that's been with us for many generations, that mysterious self can be extracted, according to the transhumanists, so that we achieve the liberation from the body. Now, in this project, I'm not the only one to see some of these interesting and ironic tendencies toward a quasi-religious movement of hope, because clearly we haven't achieved this sort of digital immortality, and it seems to remain on the horizon. Ray Kurzweil and others predict that 1245 is the year in which we'll finally achieve this sort of earthly immortality, but it remains on the horizon. It's a singularity. It's a kind of apocalyptic moment beyond which we cannot see. And so for now, we need to be content with our meager efforts to extend little by little this life until finally we can achieve that kind of breakthrough of human machine merging and that exponential explosion of intelligence that will bring about this great liberation from all of the weakness and frailty of the body. Megan O'Giblin, in this regard, is a fascinating figure because Megan O'Giblin, a great writer and essayist, spent time in her youth training and learning about Christianity. But over time, she found that she couldn't receive the answers she needed to her deeper questions. And she started to cast off Christianity as this sort of outdated remnant of the Dark Ages. And as she was searching for a more rational worldview, someone gave her a copy of Ray Kurzweil's book. I think it was The Age of Spiritual Machines. And after reading that, she thought she had discovered the rational scientific alternative. But as she studied Kurzweil's work and the larger transhumanist movement, she could not help but see the clear parallels between Christianity and this secular idea. And when she identified those parallels, she became a double apostate. She had already left Christianity, and then she decided to become an apostate from secular transhumanism because she realized that in many ways, secular transhumanism was representing and repackaging these ancient Christian ideas, whether distorting an orthodox notion of Christianity or even at times dealing more directly with movements considered by Christians traditionally to be heresy. So she saw that, ironically, the contemporary transhumanist movement that she turned to as more rational demanded more faith, more hope from her than her previous Christian belief. And so she abandoned it. And she saw that this contemporary movement had deep roots in the Judeo-Christian past, and many other authors have seen this. In the interest of our limited time, I'll just gesture at a few of them that perhaps we can talk about more later. Many authors see, of course, the clear parallel between this notion of digital immortality or some sort of technological immortality and the Christian hope for eternal life, for union forever with the Lord. But also, many authors have pointed out the fact that these secular transhumanists draw heavily on the trend of Gnosticism, particularly expressions like the Manichaean heresy, this clash between the limited and corrupt and negative material principle, and then this superior, more immaterial uh, principle that needed to be freed from constraints. So we have in many ways a kind of neo-Manichaean movement and this great desire to cast off weakness. Now, this also has very real world practical implications because this neo-Manichaean, neo-Gnostic tendency to reject the limits and evil of the body in practice leads to a very negative view of those individuals who manifest particular expressions of vulnerability, the weakest, the poorest, the most marginalized among us. And this comes out in a very powerful way when we apply, when we look at the applications in gene editing, or when we look at the neo-eugenic trends to, for instance, already harness readily available technology like in vitro fertilization and pre-implantation genetic diagnosis to seek out actively those children we consider to have the best chance of the best life going forward. And so this very theoretical view, this adoption of a kind of neo-Manichaean repackaged Christian heresy ends up having terrible practical consequences on how we treat the weakest and most vulnerable among us. Also, there's a tendency to draw on the tradition of the Pelagian heresy, which in many ways we've already alluded to. This constant perennial human quest of self salvation, of coming to ultimate happiness, bliss, peace, liberation through our own devices. And so, really, this temptation has been with us since the beginning. We can go even to Genesis chapter 3. This effort of Adam and Eve to grasp at divinity, to become gods, like gods, apart from God. But what is spectacular and beautiful is that Christianity actually says that we can become like gods, but not through our own efforts alone, but through the gift of theosis, of divinization. It's precisely what we receive in a concrete way through the saving waters of baptism. And that's not just my idea. That's the second letter of Peter, chapter 1, verse 4, that speaks of our participation in the divine nature. Now, interestingly, many generations before Julian Huxley popularized the contemporary understanding of transhumanism in the 1950s as this effort to move from biological to technological evolution. Long before he spoke of that form of transhumanism through our own efforts, a beloved poet of the country I am in, Dante il Divino, Dante, the great poet, actually used the term in Paradiso, his final section of the Divine Comedy. In the very first canto, upon his arrival in heaven, he speaks of the term transhumunar. Transhumunar. He uses in the presence of the saints. He gazes upon the saints, those who have opened themselves to divinization, those who have collaborated with the free gift and have been elevated beyond the limits of their human capacity. There he uses the term transhumunar. And so we see this striking similarity, but also profound difference. Both movements, Christianity, secular transhumanism, long for, seek to overcome the limits of our human nature. We're both acutely aware of the pain and suffering of this life, sickness, suffering, aging, death. Something in us rebels against that. We have this shared resistance to these faults and failings. And yet there's something profoundly different, because in Dante's vision of transhumanism, it begins in a gift. The gift by God's initiative to grant us the share and participation in divine nature. And that gift brings about an elevation. We are now made partakers in the divine nature. And this transhumanizing process does not abolish our nature. It does not renounce our corporality. It rather perfects it. And so I think the challenge today for many of us is seeing how this contemporary, impoverished view of transcendence can be purified and elevated so that we can truly achieve the perfection we were made for. Thank you for your attention, and we welcome your questions.
Thank you, Father Michael, for these excellent ideas, and thank you, Wael, for all of your excellent ideas. So there's certainly lots to talk about. We will start with the questions right away. A couple of questions came in, and I want to direct one of them to you, Father. So there is a gentleman here, Carl Youngblood, who is a religious transhumanist, and he is the founder of, or co-founder of, Christian Transhumanist Association and the Mormon Transhumanist Association. And he says, what do you see as compatible with a Christian faith, and specifically in the two realms of Christian stewardship over creation, and then the idea that we participate in divine nature? So please keep the answers short so we can answer the other questions as well. But Father, why don't you make a start here?
No, I just laugh because I think these spectacular thoughts are more than enough for another webinar, and so I'd love to follow up with them on another time. But
Yes,
I would
no
say as
kidding.
briefly as possible that I think there's a lot of room for common ground there, and my goal is always to see how we can perfect the givenness of our human nature as co-creators, but understanding properly our secondary causality and our dependence upon the creator. And so our human nature has been authored. And so what I resist fundamentally is the trend toward radical self-definition, self-creation that comes out frequently in transhumanist literature. I think Anders Sandberg's notion of morphological freedom goes in that direction. I think Martine Rothblatt is perhaps the clearest in speaking of our humanity as being fundamentally self-creating. And so I would resist that sort of self-creation, self-definition. But if we appreciate the givenness and the richness of our human nature and discern properly, reflect prudently on all of the pharmacological, biotechnological interventions that might perfect without undermining our cognitive or affective, emotional, physical dimensions, then I think all of those even enhancements, and I know this becomes controversial, but I think even certain enhancements might be incorporated into a larger vision of a teleological human nature, an intrinsically purposeful kind with certain ends that are inbuilt. But that's just a very brief gesturing at what's well worth a longer conversation.
Well, would you have something to add from the more scientific point of view?
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for letting me follow on from you here, Father. So I do absolutely agree with the idea of enhancement, but also this goes back to enhancing to what? Now, morphological freedom, of course, if we're going to respect diversity in any form, it seems that the diversity of form should be a good starting point, because without that, what form of diversity can there be? But I think that the key point there would be that the transhumanist quest is actually not so compatible with Christianity as I think, or at least the Christian transhumanists, whatever vision it is that they have. I'm not sure it's quite as coherent as they might see it. I mean, I titled my presentation Heresiarchy, because the heresiarchy meaning the original heretic. And to me, the fact that I think transhumanists, this is slightly different to your view, Father, I think they do recognize order in the world. They recognize, for example, the finiteness or the finitude of their own forms. They recognize that there are physical laws and other forms of laws, or so it would seem. They simply detest these laws, right? And this goes back to the initial Gnostic impulse, which is reality is conjured up by an evil demiurgus who hates me, hates us, and so I want to escape from the boundaries. And that view of what reality is so fundamentally in contrast to the Christian viewpoint, which views this reality as a stepping stone to perfection that comes exactly as you said correctly, and here is where we agree, I think, through salvation. These views don't have much room for compromise between them, especially because in the Gnostic transhumanist pursuit of this form of perfection, they can do a lot of damage along the way.
Very good. Thank you, Well. Good. Youngbell has a second question, but I'm going to move on. Again, there's much to discuss. For Deborah Knox, she asked about the slides. I think that is no problem. Just contact each one of us independently and you can get the slides. Now, there's another interesting question here that I found, which is, do you see an aggressive or any signs of an aggressive pushback rather than a few vaguely concerned op-eds here and there in the New York Times against the transhumanist trend in secular intellectual culture or secular popular culture? So this is really interesting, and I think we should all speak to that. So, Wael, why don't you make a start, followed by Father, and then I'll say something about that as well. Do you see any signs of an aggressive pushback?
I want to give the short answer first, which is yes. But let's be more specific to what. So I mentioned earlier that genetics and gene editing wouldn't necessarily be the solution. Well, why is that? Well, you can edit the genes however much you want, but the carrier will still die, right? So the gene editing itself provides no solution rather, to the problem of immortality. And I think that the desire to create artificial intelligence in many ways comes from that inevitability of death. Because if I can't make myself immortal, then at least I can give birth to something that will be. If I can't leave all of you weak and puny humans behind, at least my brainchild will be able to leave you all behind, right? And this is something that we should obviously take very seriously. We're no longer in the realm of games and jokes, even though ultimately, again, cosmic radiation, meteor showers, climatic change, all kinds of variables which expose the electronical circuitry of these machines to doom and death, just like our own human forms. Trying to create such a machine, if indeed it were possible, would obviously do a lot of harm to the rest of us who are trying to live normal, good Christian lives. And I think that the movement which is calling for us to slow down on the creation of AI is something that is actually much better recognized and much more supported than the movement which is, protesting outside Brian Johnson's house. The latter is not so much of a big movement; it's kind of fringe. maybe coming from this Western view of individualism, do whatever you want, it's your own body, even when it's not. But with the AI singularity, I do see real serious voices of concern being raised. And I'm sure that on the governmental level as well, serious discussions are being had by serious people.
Yeah, so in many ways to approach it, one thing that comes to mind is a recent work called "The End of Reality" by Taplin, and it was a fascinating critique, specifically of the kind of transhumanist ideas that are being promoted by very influential billionaire figures. And the main argument of the book, coming from what seems to be a very secularist, I'd say also quite politically liberal perspective, is that these transhumanist projects are distracting us from using our scarce resources to address more pressing, urgent needs that we might not be able to quote unquote solve, but that we could at least mitigate, improve upon. And you can add any host of them, basic access to fundamental health care, environmental protection, whatever it may be. These other grand challenges of humanity that could be easily neglected if we're more concerned about space colonization or giving a cognitive edge to the wealthy.
So from my end, this is hard to judge. I would say that transhumanism, even though the novels and the books are bestsellers, sometimes kind of multi-million copy bestsellers, I think the leading thinkers are actually very few, and it will depend on their platform and how to disseminate their ideas, and then also what influence they have on politicians. Harari now, he used to be the transhumanist of the World Economic Forum. The World Economic Forum itself sort of has gotten some kind of reputational dent now with the things that come out about Klaus Schwab, and I wonder how that will affect his project. Nick Bostrom, we said this briefly at the beginning, he doesn't have the Oxford research tank was, think tank was closed, and research center was closed for a variety of reasons. So I think many transhumanists don't have a direct influence necessarily, but their influences, as Father Baggot suggested, more cultural, and then maybe directly in politicians' ears. It's hard to judge. The pushback is there. There's literature. There's definitely literature, longer and shorter version. I mean, we're contributing to that as well, I hope. But I think to be honest, as a philosopher, I see that the pushback has to come from the individual fields, and it will. Psychologists will push back in their own realm, and programmers, IT programmers will push back in their own realm, bioengineers will push back in their own realm, theologians are already pushing back, philosophers are already pushing back. So I think that kind of impossibility will emerge in the specific scientific context in which it is tried, and the collateral damage will appear there as well. And that's where the pushback will come back from. Right. There's a really interesting question here, which is, I'm going to take this one. It seems like transhumanism can take a few different forms. Is there a certain aspect of form that is the largest threat? I think every transhumanism that denies any kind of stable human nature would be the largest threat. It's really hard to judge and to discriminate between those different types of transhumanism, and also not all transhumanists agree on everything. So that's why it's hard to answer this question. But I think the largest threat is linking to back what Father Baggot said, is seeing a life as something made rather than something received. And once we are there, we have already entered the paradigm of power, and we have left the paradigm of love. And that, to me, is very problematic. Well, the next question I'm going to throw to you, which is, and please be brief, and I know you can be very lengthy here. How does this comport with evolution? Is transhumanism the next phase of evolution?
So, very brief answer. Evolution in the microbiological or conventional sense, the grand theory of evolution, requires us to die. It requires us to die and pass on our genes. In fact, there is a theory within the field of evolution or evolutionary biology called the Red Queen hypothesis, which states that sexual selection emerged specifically so that we could swap our genes and therefore die and allow ourselves to build up herd immunity, so to speak, to parasites, to parasitic organisms. So death is part of evolution as much as life is. And the transhumanist enterprise in seeking to defeat death and seeking to defeat reality itself is actually just as much opposed to evolution as it is to everything else, including all of the more conventional goods that have been mentioned here.
Amazing. Thank you, Wael. Here is a Catholic priest from Kenya whose question is, and this is a good one, transhumanism seeks to change human nature. Natural law ethics is one of the major ethical approaches used, where we have the fundamental axiom that action follows being. So could transhumanism change the norms of natural law? In other words, will a modified human remain human, and to which extent? And what about moral responsibility? I feel like this should go to Father Michael. Keep it brief, please.
Yes. Well, the briefest response would be, please listen to my recent Thomistic Institute talk that I gave on March precisely about the question of the possibility of changing human nature. But briefly, I would say my contention is that different interventions may profoundly alter or adjust certain physical, cognitive dimensions. Maybe we'll even have humans that are of a different phenotype that just have appearances that are strikingly different from our own, perhaps even uh, forms of communication or aesthetic experiences that are difficult for us to imagine. But I think we would still be dealing fundamentally with rational animals that may be enhanced or altered in some of their dimensions. So I would be reluctant to foresee a new philosophical species. Perhaps we could speak in terms of a biological species developing somehow, but that's quite speculative. But I would be very reluctant to think that we would actually produce philosophically something that is so radically different that it's no longer a rational animal. So I think that natural moral law would still be a helpful framework because, as we know, it traditionally promotes not a static notion that reduces nature to a kind of set of mere biological processes, but again, as you could say broadly, is referring to an intrinsically purposeful kind of being with certain ends. And so I think we would still be dealing with rational animals and still need to assess whether those interventions are contributing or detracting from human flourishing according to that metaphysical kind of being.
Thank you, Father. There's a lot more questions here that we could address. I would like each one of the listeners who has asked a question that we could not address due to time constraints to email us. Each one of us, I think, can be found online, and to take over the conversation there. I'm going to take the last question, which is, what are some good resources to read more about transhumanism? Well, I am glad that you asked, though we have a book in progress, Contra Deum Contra Mundum, Transhumanist Ideology Contested, which me and Wael will edit, and Father Michael will be featured in it, along with hopefully some 20+ specialists taking on transhumanism from a philosophical, theological, biological, historical, and IT background to give you the best possible overview. This book is meant to be accessible. It's meant to be it's meant to be written for a wide audience, and it should hopefully be it's in the works, and it should hopefully come out this year. So do stay tuned for that. That would be a great resource to start with. But obviously, we can also give you more homework if you write us by email. This is from an anonymous source. Last but not least, please sign up for the IHE newsletter for more webinars. They have great book launches. They have great webinars. I myself will have one towards the end of the year again. So please join us again. Thank you, everybody, for coming. It's a great joy. Thank you, Father. Thank you, Wael, for taking the time. And I'm sure that the conversation will continue offline. So thanks, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next time.